Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Hallie Perlick, and I am the technical manager for this session on innovative approaches in agriculture, nutrition, and health, chaired by Sarah Young. Thank you for taking part in this ANH Academy Week, and welcome to day 2. We are looking forward to a robust and interactive panel today. This is a quick reminder that if you need to access the conference materials and program, they can be found on our website at anh-academy.org/ANH2020. Before Sarah takes the conversation forward, just a few technical announcements. First, this session is being recorded and will be posted on the ANH Academy website following the conference. Second, all participants have been muted, but please do introduce yourselves using the chat function. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization that you work with. You can access the chat box by clicking on the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We encourage you to share your webcam video as well during the session if you do not have bandwidth issues. If you prefer not to, you can put up a profile picture when you are logged into your Zoom account. Later in the session, we will open up the conversation with a Q&A. If you have questions, we invite you to share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we will do our best to raise them during Q&A. If we have time, we may ask participants to raise their hands so we can call on you to speak your question aloud. Lastly, if you experience any technical issues, please check your audio settings and internet connection. You can always reconnect to this session using the same Zoom link that you used to get here today. If you have a technical question, please do feel free to send me a private message using the chat box. Thanks so much, and over to you, Sarah.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's nice to see people from across the time zones of the world. And it's really a pleasure to be here. It's bittersweet. I miss being in the same room with many of us here. One of the many losses of COVID. But one of the benefits is that we still, the science marches on, we still get to see each other, at least through Zoom, and exchange some really important information on innovative approaches to agriculture and nutrition. So the way that these work, I'm not sure how many of you have been to other ANH sessions, but the way this works, we have an hour together. And the participants in this panel have already recorded their slides. So you can see those at length. Either maybe you have beforehand, maybe you will after. But right now we're going to open the floor to each of them in turn for 3 minutes. And that's a hard stop 3 minutes. I'm ruthless, even at a distance, where they can talk about what their findings were. And meanwhile, you're welcome and encouraged to chat questions into the box here. You can also email them to me. And then after 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, we'll have a lively and robust conversation about all that we've learned. Any questions or clarifications before we begin? Well, then with that, I would like to introduce you to Brooke Coletzi. She's at Tufts University, and she's going to be talking about a really exciting tool called the ANH2020.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Yes, so I'm just going to give a quick recap of my presentation on ANH2020. So ANH2020 is an innovative dietary assessment platform designed for use in low and middle income countries. And its overarching goal is to scale up, the overarching goal of the Index project is to scale up dietary data collection in low and middle income countries. And we know that routine collection of these data are limited by a range of challenges. The 3 main challenges we've identified are listed on the screen: limited resources, incomplete research infrastructure for the collection and processing of quantitative individual level dietary data. And then finally, there are technical and methodological challenges associated with collecting this information. So our answer to these challenges is the ANH2020 dietary assessment platform. And our platform is shown in the diagram on the screen right now. And it has 3 main components. The first component is the ANH2020 web app, which is an online database of dietary data inputs, which are required for the collection and processing of dietary data. And this is our answer to one of the greatest challenges we identified, which is incomplete infrastructure for readily accessing these types of information pieces that are needed for running dietary surveys. So researchers can log onto the web app and do a search for dietary data inputs that have been shared by other researchers and use those in their own survey, or they can upload their own. And then the second major component, which is linked to the web app, is the Index24 mobile app. This is an Android-based app used for data collection, and it's an adaptable app based on the 24-hour recall method. And interviewer administered, it can be used offline, and as I said, it can be adapted to any context. You can customize it by uploading context-specific dietary data inputs, as well as adapting the language and questionnaire text of the app. And then finally, we have our analytical reporting feature, which is the third component of the dietary assessment platform. And this analytical reporting feature produces a gaps report that assists researchers in processing their dietary data after they've completed their survey. It also produces a number of processed data files, so addressing some of the challenges associated with processing dietary data. And researchers can also download summary statistical reports as well as the raw data files to complete further analyses in a statistical program. So that was my super quick 3-minute spiel. So I'm happy to take questions at the end of the presentation.
And by the way, that was with 10 seconds to spare. Congratulations.
Oh, okay, good.
Very nice. Thank you for that. So
Sure.
as I said, for those of you who are just joining, you're welcome to chat questions into the chat box right now. But we're going to do an overview of everyone's presentation before we start interacting with those questions. So I would like to pass the mic to Rain Massa. He's at UNC in Chapel Hill. Rain, please take it away.
Okay, there it is. Thank you, Sarah, and glad to be here and good to see everyone. So my presentation is about testing measurement variance of the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale. In other words, what I am interested in establishing is whether does household food insecurity mean the same thing for different groups of youth? And I'm interested in this particular question because we did some analysis comparing group scores between or across gender and across age groups. So we want to establish that the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale is being understood in a conceptually similar manner by different groups of youth in our study in Ghana. And so what we did find was that this particular scale is non-invariant across gender and across age group. And what that really means is that the overall structure of the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale, which is, we tested a unidimensional or one-factor model, that particular one-factor model hold across different groups of youth, either by gender or the developmental stage or age. It is also invariant in terms of the individual items. If you recall, there are 9 items comprising the scale, and all the individual items have similar weights. And what that means is they're equally salient to the construct of food security for different groups of youth. And then finally, we also established scalar invariance, which is really what we would like to show and demonstrate as a measure of, or as an evidence, statistical evidence of an invariant scale. And in this case, we were able to establish that youth were responding to the scale items in similar ways across different groups. So it's not because of other factors such as social norms or perhaps developmental differences, but we were able to establish that the responses are due to the differences in the underlying construct. And that is my short summary of my presentation.
I appreciate that, Rain. That was with 40 seconds spare. You're making my job very easy. So I'd like to move now to Sylvia Alonso, who's at ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute in Ethiopia. Sylvia, please, the mic.
So I say hi to everyone with my video on, but I'll switch it off now because my internet is not very strong. Right, so my project works with the African Union on validating an index on food safety. So let me give you the background. This is part of the CADE biannual review that African countries sort of initiated in 2015, in an attempt to keep track of progress on, originally had 43 indicators, and about 3 years into the initiative, the African Union included a food safety index. None of the indicators have been evaluated or validated. They were started and they are kept as they were. But the food safety index that we were part of in their development, we decided to do a bit of an evaluation and validation to see if we can improve it. Our aim was to try and see if this index can really give a proper picture of food safety, the food safety situation in African countries, but also allow tracking progress. So seeing countries that go from bad to better, rather than giving a static picture. And also whether it allows countries to benchmark against each other to see how they are making progress compared to others. What we are finding is that I think there was a big buy-in with the food safety index. A lot of countries contributed data to that index compared to others. Countries in general see it as relevant. They see it can help them make a case for food safety and improving food safety in the country. So if they can actually measure food safety, they can make a case to the ministries to mobilize resources and put resources into food safety. Now, on the downside, what we are seeing is that the index, the way it is designed as 3 sub-indexes, there is some work to do to actually make an index that can track progress. So actually distinguish between countries that are doing really well, of those that are just doing well, and also on the lower of the scale. So distinguishing between countries that are doing very bad and countries that are doing only a little bit bad in terms of food safety. So I think we have to improve it a little bit to make it more discriminatory. Also, the 3 indexes don't speak to each other very much, so we want to see how we can modify the index so that the 3 sub-indexes can really come together into a meaningful score. And what we are finding is in the countries there's a big lack of data on surveillance needs to be worked on if we want to have meaningful data. So I think I'll leave it there for now. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sylvia. I think that we heard about 93% of what you said, and we got the gist of it, but we may ask you to repeat as the questions unroll. So we have a number of questions for the discussants. I'm going to start in chronological order from how we, the order of the speakers, but feel free to migrate. So the first question is from Peggy Konas-Bohr, and this is for Brooke. She'd like to know if the dietary inputs are available for foods typically consumed in all or at least most countries, and if those include ultra-processed foods.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. That's a great question. So the Index24 platform is actually not publicly available yet. We're still in the process of populating the database, and populating the database with as data from as many countries as possible is obviously our ultimate goal. But currently we have just started with a couple priority countries that we worked in an earlier phase of our project, Burkina Faso and Vietnam, and we're also populating the database with data from Nigeria, but our focus in the future will be to add more data, definitely. And in terms of whether it will have highly processed foods or not, the focus is really on including the most commonly consumed foods. And so the focus for the researchers who are providing their data it would be on them to include highly processed foods, but that has been a focus of the countries that we've added so far.
I need to interrupt the flow of questions because as moderator, I've made a terrible mistake. I have only given the floor to 3 of the 4 discussants, and I deeply apologize. I hope we're still friends, Winnie. Winnie Sambo has an excellent presentation to summarize for you. She's from the University of Cape Town, and she'll be talking about differences in results of assessments of child malnutrition. Winnie, the floor is yours, and my sincere apologies.
That's fine. Thanks, Sarah. And yes, we're still friends. So my research is basically what I'm interested in the context of South Africa is to assess the comparability of malnutrition estimates from survey data. So we know that income and expenditure surveys are increasingly used for to collect anthropometric and health data. So this is in addition to the traditional demographic and health surveys that are carried out in many countries across the globe. And in some cases, the income and expenditure surveys also coincide with the demographic and health surveys. So in this case, I was very interested in examining or establishing the trends and the dynamics of malnutrition in South Africa, and to look at the comparability of estimates from a panel study that was conducted between 2008 and 2017 that covered over 28,000 individuals and their households. So in this slide, I show you the under 5 malnutrition estimates focusing on stunting, overweight, underweight, and resting. And what is most notable is the significant increase within a 2-year period in stunting by about 7.5 percentage points. And then we see a significant decline, very sharp declines between waves 2 and 3 and between waves 4 and 5. And so we see this affecting the stunting more than other malnutrition indicators. So one possibility is the high levels of missing data, which is normally quite present in survey data when it comes to anthropometric data. And what we see in the needs panel is this high prevalence of missing data, particularly in the youngest age group and in the richest households. So we, as part of this research, we thought perhaps this high levels of missing data might be resulting in bias in our estimates. And so what we did was to generate new weights to correct for this missing data problem using inverse probability weighting. And what we found was that this does not have any effect on the malnutrition estimates, and these wide shifts that we see over time remain. So then the more plausible, another plausible explanation to this could be the measurement errors that are specific to the time periods that these surveys were conducted. And to test this hypothesis, we ran a pooled linear regression model controlling for time and other known covariates of malnutrition, ranging from child demographics, maternal characteristics, and some survey characteristics, at least this was limited by the data available. And what we found that even after controlling for all known characteristics of malnutrition, at least what's present in the data is that children were more likely to still have worse height for age in 2008, 2010, and 2012, so in the earlier waves. So in conclusion, what this analysis shows us is that the malnutrition estimates are likely biased and affected by the measurement errors. Thank you.
Thank you, Winnie. And again, my apologies. So let us continue with the Q&A. I see lots of questions rolling in. That's great. I'm going to go back to Brooke and ask her a question that probably is on the mind of many people in this chat, which is, how do we get to use this? What do we need in terms of training to use the Index 24? And how much of the time of our surveys will it take to administer?
Yeah, those are all great questions. So first of all, the Index 24 platform is actually not currently publicly available. Our plan is to make it publicly available by the end of 2020. So that's question number 1. And in terms of training requirements, I can tell you what we're working on as part of this current phase of our project. So there will be training materials obviously available, training videos and whatnot. in terms of how, was that your last question? How long it takes to use?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to answer that question. Just, it is largely dependent, I think, on the survey. But one thing that we really hope that the Index24 platform will assist researchers with is by making use of the web app and making use of available dietary data inputs. We hope that that will shorten the upfront time that it typically takes to prepare for a survey by just providing access to available inputs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but in terms of how long it takes to use, it's a bit tricky to answer just because it's quite survey dependent.
That's right. Okay, thank you. And on the diversity of the diets there as well.
Yeah.
So someone in this chat, Musumi Das, is really interested to use it in West Bengal, India. And so maybe the two of you can talk privately.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Let's shift gears a little bit and move to rain. This is a question from Grace Marcus. Dr. Massa, could you speak a little bit about the Ghana sample used for this study? And if you looked at the urban-rural difference?
Thank you, Dr. Marquez. Sample, the sample came from a financial inclusion project that was comprised, that included, I'm guessing, about 6,200 youth. While food insecurity was not a main construct or a main concept that was examined in the study, we were able to measure it at endline. And we have about 4,200 sample. Short answer to whether we examine urban-rural differences, no. But I'll be happy to, if somebody can also examine that in terms of invariance, the data are publicly available. But in terms of just briefly the distribution of gender, it's 50-50. And by 2014, I think more than 60% of our sample are in late adolescence to about young adults. I hope that answers your question.
Great. I'll follow up on that question, which is to ask if you had plans to look at the invariance in other food insecurity scales. I mean, the HFIAS has been very broadly used, but there are a number of others, including, and I'm thinking of the FIES, Food Insecurity Experiences Scale. That's the SDG indicator. Mm-hmm.
Excellent question, Sarah. Yes. Unfortunately, we have not been able to incorporate the food insecurity experience scale in some of our current studies. But yes, the short answer is we will. Hopefully we get additional funding to be able to collect this data, but happy to also look at invariance in existing data set. But one thing that I would also like to highlight is the importance of testing measurement invariance, especially when we're comparing group scores, because the assumption is that these distinct groups are understanding the constructs, the items, equivalently or in a conceptually similar manner, but unless we show statistical evidence, we may not be able to validly or confidently claim that the scores are actually reflective of the true underlying construct. I think this is something that Winnie alluded to in her presentation.
Thank you. Well, I have more questions for you, but I'm going to move now to our friend in Ethiopia. Sylvia, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can hear this?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great.
But I'm aware my internet is very
Okay, so how much further do you think the index needs to go to be an accurate reflection of food safety measures in countries? And how much further does it need to go, and how much further can it go feasibly?
Yeah, I think it is already at a very good state from what we've seen, but I think a few minor tweaks could actually make it much more useful. as I was saying, it's a matter of refining some of the indicators so that they not only speak about existence or not of something, but in which state that is. For example, are there policies in place in a country to enforce food safety? Countries may say yes, but it's not whether they exist or not as a piece of law, but actually how well they are informed and what is the capacity of the countries to enforce them. So I think things like that is just tweaking the indicators so that they speak about a progression in a continuum between, very bad food safety to very good. So I think that is already fairly good in the index. The other aspect that needs to improve is the availability of key data. And I mentioned before issues around foodborne disease specific surveillance data. There is data on diarrhea cases, there's data on deaths, aflatoxin to a certain level like liver cancer, but is not very well documented in most countries in Africa. So I think there has to be a push to improve those surveillance systems and making a bit more specific for foodborne related issues. So I think those couple of things could actually make sure that the index becomes much more useful and relevant for the countries. Over.
Yeah, so thank you. I asked you a two-part question, so I was ambitious. Let me repeat the second part of the question, which is about feasibility. I mean, as scientists, we love to say, if only we had more data, then we could know. How feasible is it for countries to collect these indicators that we would all love to know about?
So within the food safety index, some of them are fairly straightforward to collect, like issues around, if we craft good indicators that really speak very well about, where the countries are, say, for example, how enforceable certain policies are, I think those can be done fairly straightforward. Now, the issue around surveillance and health data, but also trade, it really depends a lot on the countries. There are some countries that are very well advanced, and they just need to tweak a little bit their current health surveillance systems. That quite a lot of them have been actually been sort of initiated by the WHO. So I think they just need to tweak them a little bit to make them more relevant for food safety as a food safety indicator. Like some other countries are really quite behind and they lack the capacity, they lack even the financial resources to do that. So I think another aspect of this index that applies to all across Africa is the diversity across countries. But somehow when you have countries that really lead this process and can show how this can be done, other countries can actually then a little bit mirror that. And that's the benchmarking part of this exercise. So countries can compare themselves and try and see where they want to get to. So I think, for those will require much more effort. And maybe it's not going to be done even in the next 5 years. This monitoring somehow ends 2025, but I'm hoping that all these assessments we are doing will inspire a next generation of indexes that actually are much more grounded on science and on evidence.
Mm-hmm. Maybe eventually you can work up what the costs of such data collection would be, because I sure would like to see that. I'm going to move now to who I'm still friends with, Winnie. And I would like to tell you that your presentation made me nervous about survey data and how the reliance upon it. But I think you probably have some suggestions for how we can do a better job. So you concluded by saying it's important that we do a good job with survey data collection. What improvements would you like to see in those two data sets that you presented to us?
So yeah, definitely concerning issues around the malnutrition anthropometric survey data, and particularly because a lot of these budget surveys are increasingly collecting this. And I recently had a discussion with a public health practitioner, professor here in Cape Town, and she said that economists should stop collecting anthropometric data. So basically what she was alluding to the fact that people just think it's just easy to go out there with a questionnaire and just collect any data without actually putting more thought into how this data is collected. And in the case of my study, what became clearer was that these measurement errors are more likely to be occurring in the younger age group, so particularly among children aged 0 to 2 years. And there are challenges in how children are generally measured, particularly taking their weight measurement as opposed to their height measurement as opposed to weight, because then the field workers have to sort of lay them down on a table and try to ensure that they get the right measurement. And I think one of the, going to your question around suggestions on what should be done, definitely is the fact that there needs to be more focus has to be paid towards training, adequate training of field workers who go out to collect this anthropometric data. So what I do know from other DHS, the demographic and health survey data, is that they send a dedicated team of field workers to collect that kind of data, and they are separate from the, from the ordinary team that would collect all the other household related data. So I think that's a good strategy in the sense of you send people who are actually qualified, who understand how to use the equipment, who know how to handle kids, particularly very young children, and also how to engage with parents, because parents get very fidgety around people just touching their kids and measuring them. And all those factors, I mean, they seem like they shouldn't affect, but they actually do affect, because you actually want a very good, you want to be as accurate as possible, because the height for age, the Z-scores are sensitive to the kind of the kind of measurements that you get. Another factor is data on age, which is a big, which is the other part of the anthropometric Z-score. So you've got your height data, then you've got your age data, which you then combine to construct the height for age Z-scores. And having accurate age data can actually make a difference. So trying to get records from parents as much as possible, birth certificates, for example, try to get to the exact age of the child also does help with that. So basically, I would say it goes back to training of field workers, trying to get the accurate age data and so forth. I think that's what I would say. And as well as trying to get people who actually understand what these anthropometric measurements are for and why they're important and so forth. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. I mean, anyone who's ever tried to take the measurement of a recumbent child who's screaming knows that it's not for the faint of heart. Can I ask you a related follow-up question? Would you say that the two surveys might be redundant? Should they possibly be streamlined? Question mark.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you another question in return. When are you saying to them being streamlined in the sense of being combined?
Are these efforts diffuse, and should we better put the resources? I don't know how feasible this is, but I mean, people like to play in their own backyard.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I don't know if the solution would be to, for example, tell income and expenditure survey owners. In this case, most of the time is actually national statistical bodies, that they should not include a module on anthropometric data. I mean, the challenge is that historically, this kind of data, when I say this, I mean nutrition, anthropometric data is scarce. And at a national level is usually sparse because of the effort that goes into it and so forth. So statistical agencies, including the anthropometric modules, are sort of a response to people asking for regular data, regular monitoring data on the anthropometric status of children, so, and combined with other households characteristics, other household data. So we sort of look at the correlations between anthropometric data and a wide range of other covariates. So that was a response to that. And in a way, it's a good thing, because then you have this data. But then, of course, then there's a question about the quality of the data that's been collected. So I wouldn't say that it's a bad thing. What I would say is that more attention needs to be paid to collecting better data. I think it shouldn't be something that people, statistical agencies should just take as just another module that can be easily collected. I think the issue is that it has to be better quality data. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's always a question, is it better to have bad data or no data at all?
Yeah, my professor says that there's no bad data. Like data is not completely useless. And I think, I mean, there's definitely, so part of my research, what I did was also to compare correlations across the five waves of the survey. And what was also imagined was that there were similarities in correlation. So for example, between child height, stunting in this case, and income levels and maternal characteristics and so forth. So in that way, it's not necessarily useless, completely useless, but what is important is that, so it's not completely useless, but the issue is how we report the prevalences, because that's what policymakers also use. They often focus on the prevalence rather than on the correlates and so forth. So I wouldn't say that it's completely useless. There's still something that we can salvage from it.
Thanks, Winnie. I'm gonna turn our attention back to our first presenter. This is a question for Brooke. Brooke, it's always scary when new methods are developed to do something that we've always been doing a certain way. And there are some questions for you about how it will compare, or how this new method will change old methods, and what maybe some of the limitations of this method are when compared to traditional methods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So we recently, at the end of 2019, we finished conducting a validation survey of our tool, so the Index24 platform, compared to a pen and paper based 24-hour recall, which we consider a more traditional way of collecting this information. And we're still in the process of analyzing our data, and our results should be available by the end of the year. But I think, so in terms of ways in which our method might improve, as well as the limitations, I think our hypothesis is that, again, addressing the time and cost issue, that hopefully, and our validation study looked at the time and costs associated with using these two different modes of data collection. But our hypothesis is that the time and therefore cost associated with collecting information on a digital platform may be less compared to a pen and paper based questionnaire, due to the sorts of time-saving approaches available, such as what I mentioned earlier, just the availability of inputs that are already formatted according to the needs of the data collection tool. And then there are, of course, data validation checks that exist when you collect data using a digital format versus, pen and paper, which opens up the possibility of data entry errors, which you can control for better using a digital platform. And in terms of limitations, we heard, I think, from some people in the field that they sometimes found using a pen and paper based approach to be a little bit more flexible. One thing with using a digital tool is that, it is structured, and, you have to go through certain questions and screens in a certain way. And there's, I suppose, a little bit more flexibility in collecting data in a paper-based survey. But we'll be interested to see the results of our survey to see whether, the rigidity, I guess you could say, of using a digital format and the controls that we implemented for inserting responses and controlling for data entry errors, that kind of thing, have a measurable impact on the differences between the two modes. So we look forward to those results, and they'll be published by the end of the year.
Yeah, I think we all look forward to them. I mean, it's always scary to try a new thing, but it's also nice to get modern with some of our measurement approaches.
Yeah.
Winnie, did you have a follow-up question on that? You were shaking your head vigorously when I asked the question. Maybe not. Okay, great. Let's move to Rain. Now, Rain, if I understand, to date, you've done these analyses using the HFIS in 2 countries, in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm going to ask you, these questions have been posed, to speculate. Do you expect you will also find a lack of difference in other parts of the world, such as South Asia?
Mm-hmm. That is possible, or probably likely. The other study you were referring to, Sarah, unfortunately, we have data restrictions, and so we have to go back with our data analysis. But yes, it's likely that there, because even within country, across different groups, I think there's a question about like the urban-rural difference. Even though we've established invariance by gender or by age group, it is plausible or possible that if we look at urban-rural divide or grouping, that there might not be the same level of invariance.
Mm-hmm. And relatedly, have you considered issues of seasonality when testing the validity?
So time, so we have, once we get the clearance from the South African colleagues, the South Africa data set has 4 data collection points, and we'll be able to see whether the interpretation of the same scale is invariant across time.
Thank you. Sylvia, I will hand you the proverbial mic and ask you a question that's been sent in from Sol Cuevas. And she'd like to know, what is the role of private actors and private-public collaboration in collecting data for the Food Safety Index?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think ideally and ultimately, food safety is responsibility of the private sector. Like as we see now in the industrialized countries, the private industry is the one that is responsible to put safe food in the markets. Now, the index that I was describing applies to Africa. And as I said, there is a wide range of situations in Africa, countries that are really mirroring what's happening in industrialized countries and really can, a little bit, the private sector owns a lot of that data and can generate it, but there are other countries where we are still a bit behind, and is still right now the role of the public sector to enforce food safety, to promote food safety. But as we move on, this will be changing, absolutely. And I think there will be much, much more of a role for private industry to take ownership of things like the food safety index, for example. So that's one. Now, the other challenge is that a lot of them, or at least in the index that I was describing, is composed of 3 sub-indexes, and one of them talks about trade. And I think specifically on that one, there will be a lot of scope for the private industry to help generate and report on that type of data. So in terms of food safety of products that are marketed within the country, but also exported. So I think there's potential, but perhaps we are not there yet in a lot of the countries that are currently reporting to the CADE biannual review. But yes, moving forward, ideally that should happen.
And do you anticipate willingness by the private sector to share these data?
Well, it depends when we talk what we refer to by the private sector. A lot of the food in African countries is sold and marketed through the informal channels. So it's really even hard to think on which ways this set of informal actors will be able to put together data and share it. I think there's a small pilots and small ideas here and there that are being quite successful to organize these actors in a way that really allows for traceability and for monitoring of data and other things related to food safety. But obviously it has its own challenges. So I think, yeah, I mean, it could be done, but it really requires a lot of novel thinking and novel approaches as to how we can make that work, and especially to make it work for the sake of those actors themselves, so that actually they see an incentive, they have an incentive and see a clear return on actually putting the effort into monitoring and reporting on such type of data. So I think in terms of trade there is, but we have to be a bit novel, and perhaps we've been, I mean, food safety hasn't really been given too much attention in Africa in general. I think there's interest, but you know, it has challenges of its own. I think we have to be very innovative on how we can do that and put in the private sector, which is often these small informal businesses, at the center of it all, and design strategies that work for them more than work for government.
Great. So Sylvia, let's switch from the public sector to the policy sector.
Mm-hmm.
If you could wave your magic wand and make one policy change that would dramatically increase food safety in Africa, what one item would that be? Or maybe two, but not more.
Well, I mean, I think, all right, one big one I think that could help a lot to make safer food in the markets in Africa for Africans will be policies that are more supportive of these informal markets. And I think this is something the team where we've been working on for many years and advocating for. I think what we see in a lot of these countries that are transitioning, economies that are transitioning, is that they want to do what, you know, America is doing, what Europe is doing, follow their own the standards that these countries have, while they are a bit perhaps too far to get there. So that frustrates everyone. And they tend to use more of repressive processes or repressive policies for the informal markets rather than trying to support, legitimize them, work with them to progressively upgrade them. So I think I will create a policy that is really looking at their local markets, their reality in those markets, how they operate, and basically work with them to improve food safety in a way that provides returns for these small businesses.
Great, thank you. Brooke, I'm going to ask you another question to compare and contrast the more traditional quantitative food recalls with the Index 24. And that's if there are any scenarios in which you think the traditional methods would still be relevant.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I suppose it may be relevant in a situation where you're doing a smaller survey, because I think we anticipate that a lot of the benefits associated with Index 24 will definitely pay off as you scale up with larger and larger surveys. So if you have a smaller survey with you know, a smaller sample size and therefore smaller data entry requirements, that kind of thing, it may still be worthwhile to continue with that method. But I think, yeah, we expect that the benefits of our tool will be realized at scale. So that would be maybe one scenario.
Great. Well, make sure that you tweet about it broadly so we can all know when it's
Sure.
I want to take this moment to remind everyone, I'll put it in chat, of the virtual social events right after this. I'll say it's not the same thing as standing around and drinking wine that ANH provides, because that's one of the highlights of the meetings. And I wouldn't drink wine at 9:30 a.m. anyway, I promise. But there are virtual social events that can be quite beneficial and even joyful. So I would encourage you to check those out and to sort of hope that the universe provides us an in-person venue next year. I'm going to boldly open it up for oral questions. We have taken a number of chat questions, but anyone who wants is now able to either unmute themselves or I can unmute you for questions either from panelists or from the participants.
If you have any questions and you're not able to unmute yourself, you can use the raise hand feature in the participants tab to indicate your desire to ask a question, and then we can unmute your microphone.
From teaching online, I've mastered the awkward Zoom silence. I'll give it another couple seconds. Well, then with that, I think I will appreciate ANH sincerely for all of the well-organized and PR that has happened around this meeting. It almost feels like we're together. I'm happy to see faces that we wouldn't have seen had we been in Malawi. And I look forward to future dialogues with all of you. So thank you very much, especially to our participants. Golf clap. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you, Sarah, for excellent facilitation.
Ditto. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next year, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.